go ahead and get started. Again, thank you for joining us today. Go ahead and the presenters, I will start us off, but the bulk of the presentation will be presented by John. My name is Vanessa Dutton. I am an audit partner out of the Oklahoma City office of Eide Bailey. I have about 20 years of experience in public accounting, and I've been with this firm for about 11 years. I focus on governmental entities such as colleges and universities, work on pensions and other state agencies. I'll let John do a little discussion of himself.
Yeah, this is John Alt, Principal in Data Analytics at Eide Bailey in our technology consulting practice. As the slide says, I've been in technology for a little bit over 20 years. Also, like Vanessa, I've been with Eide Bailey a little bit over 10. I work on a whole host of different technologies and industries, including higher education, but I also have experience in other industries as well. My current focus is specifically around data analytics. So I've kind of grown up doing a lot of different things in my career and in the firm, but my current focus right now is exclusively on data analytics and how that applies to our clients, including clients in higher education.
Thank you, John. We will start with the agenda of what we plan to cover today. First of all, we're going to cover what exactly is data analytics and why those are important. Then we'll cover key performance indicators or KPIs, both in general and for higher education. And then we'll turn it over to John, who will cover data strategy for higher education and go over some cases with us. And like Amy had mentioned earlier, we'll save some time for questions at the end. So again, what exactly is data analytics? This is what Wikipedia says, but basically data analytics is taking data and putting it into good use to support or enhance decision making. So the next one is why data analytics? It's a fairly new concept, but it's continuing its momentum in the business world. We know that there is lots and lots of data out there, but it's mostly in a raw format, and it can just be overwhelming. So the trick to data analytics is putting it together, gathering it, and organizing it to put it in a format that can be meaningful and insightful and timely. So some of the best practices in data analytics from an entity standpoint is it's doing more with less effort is kind of the theme behind that. And some of the best practices include monitoring trends to increase revenue or reduce expenses, so helping your overall profitability. It also allows you to monitor performance in real time, so you can make immediate adjustments as necessary. It allows you to observe multiple data sources to improve decision making and productivity. You can also analyze historical records, so you can get a feel if you are doing better, if you're doing worse, or about the same. A good example might be if you have several locations that have an inventory, and you can monitor all those inventory items at those locations and see if there's something that turns out, such as inventory turnover may be off in one location or spoilage is off. And it allows the decision makers to look a little bit closely at those particular locations. So similarly, that also helps provide forensic analysis in the same manner. So, and then last here is improve benchmarking and forecasting accuracy. And again, we want to stress that it provides very timely information. Like we said before, it can help monitor performance in real time. Here is our first polling question that Amy gave instructions earlier. It's a true or false question, and it reads, data analysis is a process of modeling data with the goal of discovering useful information, informing conclusions, and supporting decision making. Okay, great. That was what we were looking for. Well, next we'll cover key performance indicators. Both in general and for higher education. So this slide just presents a few statistics or KPIs that are relevant to most entities from a financial perspective. So you have all the basics here, including your current ratio, your debt to equity ratio, operating profit and loss. So this allows you to monitor general items such as accounts payable, cash disbursements, accounts receivable, payroll. So this is what most businesses look at on here. But for those in attendance are more interested in higher education, and here's a few examples that of KPIs that we look at in higher education. Obviously, there's a larger focus on students, such as student counts, as student head count and full-time equivalent enrollment, and how the student population progresses, such as graduation rate and retention rate. Other key factors include financial aid to monitor that, or average tuition, and you can analyze that by undergrad or graduate, and obviously resident and non-resident. So here's some of the key ones that we look at. You may even have others that are more relevant as well. If you have housing, you can look at occupancy. And if you have athletics that is key operations, there's several KPIs in that as well. The next slide is just to give you a little bit of background from our standpoint as auditors. So this is not unique to the entity, but this is letting you know how we're doing this to audit our clients. So we're using data analytics a lot during our procedures and continuing to increase that. We have found that it improves our quality and our efficiency, and it helps with our documentation and evidence as well. For instance, what we've been doing a lot of recently on most all of our clients is journal entry testing. Prior to the use of data analytics, we would just look at hundreds of pages of journal entries and select a few of those to things that might look a little unusual to determine if it is a reasonable journal entry and if support exists for that. But it was more of a sampling basis. So now we find that we're able to get all the journal entries, hundreds and hundreds of pages from our clients, and put it into our software. And we flag that we search for certain things, such as entries made on weekends or holidays or round numbers. All of those are kind of a factor that might be a higher risk for a fraudulent entry or a correction of error. So we put it into the software, and within a matter of minutes, it generates it back to us, and it gives us, instead of hundreds of pages to look at, it has identified maybe 4 or 5 pages that we can look at and sample it, and then go back to our clients and do that. So it basically allows us to identify unusual trends that may require additional analysis. And it's testing the entire population where before we did sampling. So it helps us tune in to what might be a higher risk. We're also finding that it's creating efficiencies in reporting and reviewing. iBailey actually has an innovation group right now working on tactics to implement these types of procedures within our audit. So it's just, again, the momentum is going, and we're trying to implement more of these procedures into our audit procedures. So we'll go next to our next polling question. And this is another true or false question. Auditors are not benefiting from the use of data analytics.
All right, that second poll is now open.
And again, false is what we were looking for. We are using that in our audit procedures. And at this time, I will turn it over to John for the presentation.
Again, this is John Alt. I'm going to kind of take over on kind of the strategy if you think back to our agenda for higher education and data. So we're really firm believers at iBailey that at the end of the day, you really need to have a strategy to find a way to actively use the data that you have available to you to move your organization forward. So at higher educations, one of the things that I always like to point out to clients in almost every industry, and it applies to higher ed here as well, is that you have a ton of information available to you, actually probably more so in higher ed than most other industries. The question is, what are we doing with it, and how do we find a way to actually use that information? So a common place that people would go would be their student information system. So clearly, whatever you use for scheduling, grades, all those kind of things, or even a learning management system that students are using, that's a great place to go. But in higher ed, we also have things like research data available to us that are either generated by your institution or another, social media from students or the other constituents. Demographic and economic data is one that we like to go look at a lot. So a lot of census data is publicly available, so you can generate just amazing insights about kind of the market and potential and opportunity when you overlay that data on top of data that you have internally in your systems. And then students are generating a lot of information as well. Think about the information that's generated just from them walking around campus. It could be GPS data from phones or smartwatches or interacting with the district, or excuse me, the institution and your systems. So I think I challenge organizations all the time to think kind of beyond their walls. There's a lot of other information that could be particularly valuable as you head down kind of a journey with your data analytics solutions. The second point here is really the challenge is just what are we going to do to make this effective? We would say that there's really two steps to that. One of them is just know your strategy. What are you going to do? And that's actually where we have a good chunk of content in the presentation where we're going to talk about how do you develop your strategy for using data effectively in a higher education institution. And the second thing is you clearly need to deploy the tools. So we're fans of a lot of visualization tools. We're going to use Tableau as an example today. There are clearly others in the marketplace, but Tableau is one that has very extensive use around higher education. So we felt like it was an appropriate one. So find the tools to appropriately kind of collaborate and use the information that you have available would be the second part of that. So we've kind of laid out to develop an effective data strategy, sort of 8 key steps. And there's really no magic to the 8 steps. We're fans of trying to break down a problem and say, okay, what's the right way to kind of go attack it? And those 8 steps are, and we have a slide on each of these, so I'll go quickly around kind of the 8 steps in a methodology for data strategy, and then we'll spend a little bit of time on each one of those. So the first one is engage leadership. Suffice it to say, this is not a technology problem. That's really what that one's about. And again, we'll talk about that in a bit more in detail in just a second here. It's really not a technology problem. It's also, by the same token, not an institutional research problem at your institutions as well. Second thing is to understand your source data. So you really need to understand what are you looking at. Nothing will derail a data analytics project or effort faster than people not trusting it. So understand source data is what that's really about. Consider external data. That's what I referred to earlier that says, look, this really does go beyond the walls of your institution. So consider the value that you can have there, and we'll have a couple examples to talk about in that section as well. Number 4 is to consolidate and transform data. One of the things is that we kind of use a crawl, walk, run methodology in discussions with clients. It's okay to kind of crawl and start with a tool like a Tableau to go generate visualizations and tools. Eventually, you're going to need to progress to kind of a walking or running type methodology. That requires that you do some things to kind of scale up appropriately, both with your processes and your technology. The 5th step is to tell effective stories. I always give a plug when I have this conversation to a book called Storytelling with Data. My kids affectionately call it their dad's nerd book. But the reality is that it's kind of around the competency of effectively communicating with visuals. I promise you, once you go read the book, you'll never be able to unsee bad visualizations, bad graphics in the news, all those kind of things anymore. It's really quite insightful, especially to somebody like me who's maybe a little bit more analytical, not necessarily the creative side of things. There's definitely an art to being effective here. The 6th step is establishing operational discipline. This is really about making sure that you use the analytics you put in place. I'll say in our early days, several years ago of doing this work with clients, we'd put all kinds of great insights in front of people, and then all of a sudden they'd, maybe 6 months later, they've kind of taken their eye off the mark and they aren't effectively using what they're doing. So part of your data strategy needs to be, how are we going to establish the discipline of the organization to maintain the quality of data that we're using, and B, make sure that we're effectively using it. 7th step is identifying leading indicators. So an organization in technology called Gartner presents kind of a maturity model in analytics, and they start with kind of what happened is level 1, why did it happen is level 2, what's going to happen is level 3, that's sort of predictive, and then what do I do about it, meaning technology telling me what to do, is sort of prescriptive analytics. But that 3rd step is really identifying leading indicators. It's okay to start at the earlier levels of that and work your way up, but really what you're doing then is just reporting better. You really, in almost every case, can identify things that really lead your performance and indicate it. A great example in higher ed would probably be demographics. So the census data that I referred to as an external source, I think is an excellent place to go find data that allows you to get somewhat predictive. And then the last step we have is continue to innovate. I think there's this notion of we get really good at managing certain KPIs and metrics, like the list that was shared earlier. But the reality is that if we continue to push ourselves as an organization, you need to continue to kind of revolve new KPIs, new measures into your organization to get the maximum value out of your effort. So, as I said, we have kind of a slide on each one of the 8 steps here, and I think this is actually from healthcare, but I think it's indicative across every other industry about this is obviously engaged institutional leaders. At the end of the day, this is not an IT problem, and this is a great indication of what's happened even in just the last few years. 2015 is not all that long ago to 2018. They're showing this became something that it's truly an executive level kind of involvement. So the president of your institutions, leaders, they need to be actively engaged in your data strategy. If you're going to be effective at monetizing the data to run the institution better, it's going to take kind of leadership from the top. It's not a CIO problem like it was just a few years ago. This started off as, and I'm a technology person coming at this as well, but this started off as a bunch of tools technical people would play with. And then what's happened is now we're figuring out how to use it. And that takes leaders in from, I'll just say, the functional areas of your organization. So it could be the president of the institution, could be provosts, all those kind of things. It takes leaders, the organization, and then understand its strategy going forward to be effective with your data strategy. It's not just about a bunch of technical tools and visualizations. Okay, we'll move on to the next polling question. My institution's leadership plays an active role in our data analytics efforts, yes or no? So obviously a limited polling size, but I do think that is encouraging. I would say that my experience, even in higher ed, would say that that's not always the case. One thing about higher ed, you will find presidents and leaders of institutions that are maybe a little bit more data driven from their research days. So I do think that's somewhat encouraging in higher ed. Okay, second step is to understand your data sources. So you'll oftentimes hear people like me that do this work say, create one version of the truth. It's also important to understand where the truth resides in your information. If you're starting to get data for your analytics efforts and you're starting with Excel, odds are you're in the wrong place. That data was originated somewhere else, inside your student information system, inside a research department application, demographic data from the census, whatever that might be, go get it where it originates. And I always think of this as kind of like that game of telephone, right? If you start referencing things that are somewhat removed from the source, the odds are you don't get to the truth. The story completely changes by the time you've accessed it. So it can derail an effort in a hurry to not kind of go to the source, if you will, to find the truth. The other thing I think is important there is it's important to understand kind of a cadence. Every data source has what I call a natural cadence. If you're looking at financial data, oftentimes you want to wait until our financial statement, you need the month to close before it to be really useful to look at expenses and be able to compare them to previous periods, all those kind of things. But there are other sets of data where the natural cadence is maybe overnight. I need to wait for the day to finish. So what happens is if you start developing systems that update things at the wrong cadence, that the visualizations and the stories you tell with the data end up getting off a little bit. So I think it's important to understand how often do I really want to refresh that. I would caution you that just about everybody says, well, I want to go get it every hour, every day. I want it to be, quote, real time. There is definitely a place for that in certain applications, just understanding whether the data is really changing that frequently. If it is, great, go for it. In many cases, there's more of a natural cadence that's something like overnight. A lot of the metrics we look at Adaptability and with our solutions, we look at on a daily basis, and a lot of other ones we look at weekly because of the natural cadence of things, I'll say. I think the third point on here, which is use your data strategy as an opportunity to identify and fix problems with your data sources. I mentioned earlier that not trusting the reporting or analytics is one of the quickest things to derail a data analytics effort. If you don't have good data, it's kind of the garbage in, garbage out scenario. If what you're pulling in is not good and high quality, you're just going to tell bad stories faster and people aren't going to trust it. So use this as an opportunity to find those. A really simple example I relate to at Adaptability, we all enter our time into a system. It's a very time-driven business. If you're going to look at time data, in theory, you should be able to look at that every day. But the reality is people like me don't get their time entered every day. We're supposed to, but we don't. So if you go look at it, the reality is the time to look at our time data, the cadence, is weekly. So kind of fix those kind of problems. What's happened is because we now use the data more effectively, it encourages people to enter time daily, all those types of things. So you fix kind of process problems or data source problems by understanding the source data more effectively. Frequently, there's a need to collect new data sources to meet needs. So a great example of this is that the scenario here you're describing is oftentimes you get some analytics and you realize, oh, I've kind of got a blind spot, meaning I don't have the data to collect something about a student's activity on campus. Maybe that there's a need to implement a new system to collect it or implement, I always think this is a great application for, we would say, Internet of Things, right? Things that track the movement of people and things around the campus. Sometimes you need to implement a system to fill in that blind spot to get to the analytics that you want is the last point on this slide. So considering external data, this is actually one of my favorite conversations. I think we very much get bound by, well, I want to go get data out of my student information system. I'm going to go get data out of my learning management system. And those are all true and they're great. And you have a wealth of information and they are somewhat proprietary or unique to you. That's great. But when you're really trying to understand some of the KPIs that you really want to be looking at going forward, it probably is helpful to have things like Google Analytics data. That's the example in the middle here. You can have that data and it's very, very accessible. Like it or not, that's a piece of data that we can all get our hands on for our institution, and layering that on top of your student information data and other sources can present a lot of great insights about your constituents, I'll say, and how they interact with the institution. Student generated data, this can be a whole host of things, but it could be social media, it could be, I mentioned earlier, tracking where they come and go on campus. You obviously have to have the right technology to do it, but your students are generating all kinds of information about themselves in a very public way today. It's one of the things that's sort of generational and has changed. That data is now available. A really simple one you can do, a lot of organizations will do sentiment analysis on things like social media and Twitter. So you look and say, are people saying good things or bad things about my institution? That's not a kind of a science fiction thing anymore. It's a relatively real technology, pretty easy to implement. And if people are saying bad things about your institution on Twitter, well, maybe we ought to act to change our perception or public image. I also mentioned census data. This is another really common one, publicly available. Most of the visualization tools allow you to lay geographic information system and census data on top of it. So you can do things like look at income by zip code everywhere in the country. So you could look at your income by zip code everywhere in the country, where students are come from, what that financial aid profile looks like, what their major profile looks like. All of that is quite insightful information that you could add to your effort. The fourth thing, and I promise this is the most technical we will get in the presentation, but consolidate and transform your data. So a lot of times people go, and we actually would be a fan of it, they go straight to the visualization. So you go straight to drawing a report and telling a story that we'll talk about in a second with a tool like Tableau. I think that's great. We would call that crawling. If you really want to kind of walk or run and get maximum value out of your data, what it takes is taking all of those sources. We have 3 little examples there, combining into something we would call it a data lake. That just means untransformed, unedited, but it means, think, scalability. And then you combine that into what's called a data warehouse. And now when you hear people talking about machine learning, artificial intelligence, all of the kind of hype things in the technology world, now you've got your data in a place to be able to do those things. You can dabble with that in a visualization tool like a Tableau, but you really want to kind of think about how you grow that into a more valuable asset. And that's really what you're doing by creating a data warehouse, is you're creating that asset that everyone in the institution can use. A great way to think of this, everybody could go in most of your institutions and pull data down from your student information system and generate some reports. It's hard for that to be one version of the truth because maybe you calculate it slightly different than I do for a given measure. If you provide them with an asset with all those calculations done and then they just go create stories and tell reports off of it, you can be assured that everybody's using the same data. And I think one thing I glossed over, the best insights usually take data out of more than one system. So that's what you get out of data warehousing. This is the book reference. So the author of the book that I mentioned earlier, Storytelling with Data, uses the notion of pearls. And what she says is, don't show everybody all the oysters you open, just show them the pearls. So there's kind of this making sausage analogy where you're going through creating a lot of insights, but the reality is that what matters are the pearls that you undiscovered in the process. So the other one here is think beyond financial statements. I always think of when I tell people to tell effective stories, and these are, you know, just stark examples, but the one on the left is really about visualizing and trying to tell something effectively with a visualization tool. The one on the right is Excel. If you're an accountant on the call, great, you probably love Excel. The reality is a lot of your constituents are not. If you're the head of a department, if you're a administrator of some sort, you may not be a financial person. So it's very, very helpful to have a more effective storytelling kind of methodology that allows you to move beyond Excel. They all have their places. Operational discipline. I think there's really two aspects to this. One of it is the data has to stay trusted and reliable. And then the second one is that it's really not just about the technology. Creating that asset is about changing your business processes, changing people. This is that we use the term operational discipline to articulate that. So this is that kind of infrastructure in place that says, okay, we're not just going to create a bunch of KPIs and then never look at them again. We're going to do things like have a stand-up meeting with my department every Monday, and we're going to look at how we performed last week. How are we expecting to perform next week? Truly integrated into your day-to-day operations. The cliche way to say it is become data-driven. Now, that's been out there for a while, kind of a little bit overused, but I do think instilling processes in your organization is what really matters there. I'm a huge believer in the old adage of what gets measured gets managed, but you have to have the processes and the discipline behind it to really use that information. People want to be successful, they want to do well on a KPI, but they also have to be bought into it. Identify leading indicators. One of my colleagues definitely uses the analogy here of don't look in the rearview mirror, look forward. So that again might be a little bit overdone, but the reality is that there are things that will lead your indication. Enrollment is a really simple one, but if you're looking at enrollment and you want to know what your financial results are going to look like in higher ed, a lot of it is going to come down to that. So enrollment matters. It matters what students are interested in to start to project enrollment by major. All of those things are relevant. I would say that while it's very important and we're saying you need to identify those leading indicators, most organizations start with what happened and why did it happen, and then you can move into this area. But it's important to get the organization seeing value beyond those first two stages of what happened and why did it happen. So I do think that that is an important kind of foundation building activity. The eighth step is that we just say continue to innovate. So adaptability is really important here, because what happens is if you go down the path, you identify a few key measures that you're going to work, you get really, really good at measuring those, right? So what happens is they almost become ingrained, right? And you're only going to get so much better by looking at that. So don't be afraid to adjust your measures KPIs over time. A lot of these tools will even monitor a KPI for you. You could say, look, just tell me if we ever get outside of this range. And then it'll notify you and say, hey, you started to slip here. But it's the reality is that you can definitely get more value out of these tools by almost having a cycle. These are the 5 or 6 things we're going to focus on this quarter or this year. Once we've gotten good at it, we've kind of squeezed all the value out of that. Let's move on to the next set of things in the following year. I really do believe that there's kind of no replacement for the journey here. You just have to kind of go through the process. People always ask, where should we start with our data analytics efforts? And the answer is just start. Just go do something and start the process. And a lot of times what's to come will come out of that process naturally. One of my colleagues talks about data as pouring fuel on process improvement efforts. We think that's also an important point on this, is that when you have an effort to try to eliminate waste in processes in your organization, there's nothing like data and putting it in front of people and kind of giving it to the people at the front line, if you will, and helping them understand this is creating kind of waste in my day. It's a powerful process, and actually it can be quite kind of liberating or enabling for people on your staffs. Okay, we're going to talk about some use cases now. Go back up here. Before I jump out into that, and then we'll come back to the final poll question and some questions from attendees as well. I wanted to kind of set the stage a little bit for these examples. So the first thing is, when we show these, think crawl, walk, run. You don't need to change the world with your first project. And a lot of these aren't, by the way, so I'm not suggesting that these are life-changing things. But we have 3 or 4 examples and actually a little bit of a directory that I'll show you that I thought would be a great resource kind of post-implementation after the webinar. That's what this first link is. The second thing is that data analytics projects are frequently about changing your organization. So you're going to see a bunch of neat little data here, but really, if you want to become data-driven, you need to figure out about all the things beyond the technology. So don't just focus on, hey, I'm going to go build that report that Bailey showed me in the webinar. I think that's great. It's good for you to go look at use cases, get a sense of what's out there. So just to set the stage on this, I thought this as I researched for the webinar, and again, this isn't really a commercial for Tableau or any other data analytics tools, but it is a popular one in higher ed. This is one, Tableau has this public.tableau.com that where they allow people to publish, hey, here are some neat examples I've used with the tool. So this one is, think of it as almost just a directory of applications. Someone's gone out and built a map that says, hey, look at all the neat things people are doing in higher education for data analytics with Tableau. So you'll see, you can, I'll pick this real quick. You can slice. Now I'm only looking at liberal arts institutions, obviously a lot fewer of those in this case, or I only want to look at private research. So you can kind of find who are my peers, right? This will narrow that down for you a little bit. I'm going to unfilter that a little bit. But then here are use cases. So I want to look at surveys, or I want to look at planning resources. I want to look at facilities as one of them. I want to look at trends and degrees. So if you pick any of these, you'll see the use cases. And then if you actually hover over it, it'll give you a little bit of detail on what they're doing with each one of those. The reason I thought this would be helpful is if I'm on the other end of the webinar like this, one of the challenges is often, well, now what do I do? I think this is a great place. If I were looking for applications, what do I want to do? Great place to kind of go brainstorm, get a sense of what others are doing. So in preparation for the webinar, what I did is I pulled up 3 or 4 of them. I'll need to refresh them based on time probably here, but we'll go to them in just a second. But all I did is I picked surveys. I didn't do that exact one, but and then I said I want to look at this one at Cornell. And if you go to this web page, I have 4 of them pre-pulled up to give us a sense of what people are doing. So some of them, this is again, they're not all created by Ed Bailey or anything, and they're not necessarily production in some cases. So you will find a couple of dead links out there that don't work. But I think it's still worth the effort to go poke around a little bit and learn. So I have 4 pretty different use cases that I thought I'd pull up here. The first one is around revenue and expenses. So this is a more traditional financial one is why I picked it. And they're looking at it over time. You can kind of get a sense of trends, those kind of things. Again, these are all things you could probably go take out of your finance system and create a columned report. And as an accountant, if you're an accountant, you'd probably love it. But the reality is some people don't necessarily look that way. So one of the neat things about these tools, you can kind of pick and choose years. So you can see it slice up and down. I just wanted to compare 29 and 2010. You can see it pull up. Now I'm just looking at that. And if I really want to drill down and look at just expenses, it's a little bit off screen here, but if you go down, you can get a sense of the components that make that up. So I think it is interesting. The way to think of this is that this is not intended to be a tool just for an accountant. It's more of an analyst type person. So if someone really wants to understand why do we have budget problems, you could sort of tell a story or create a palette that they would go work with to understand that. Again, I'm not an expert at any one of the 4 kind of examples that are in here, but I do think it's important to have an understanding that just by linking up to the sources of data, and most of the examples that are out there in public are going to be a little bit rudimentary in that they're using just a single system or a single source. But I think it is an interesting thing that can get you thinking, hey, when I have a hard time communicating with maybe my educators, my professors, department heads that are not accountants, maybe they would interact a little bit more effectively and get more out of a tool if it were telling a story like this versus a bunch of columns on a spreadsheet. Second example, actually loved this story. It's got to refresh here. Give it just a second. This is from, I think it's the University of Minnesota. They're looking at the use of facilities. So their use case is, hey, we're trying to get a sense of how effectively we're using our classrooms, or actually, well, you can see other categories as well. So you can pick a period here. So this does lack kind of trending, if you will, but you could pretty easily layer that on top of it. But now I want to look at general purpose classrooms, or I want to look at just computer labs. I'm going to leave it as general purpose for right now. And then I could pick which part of the campus that it's on, what building do I specifically want to look at. It's filtered down to all right now, and then the size of the room. So if I wanted to look, if you hover over some of this, you can see some of the metrics. It's telling you that this room at 10 Church Street Southeast has a capacity of 30 people. It's utilized 79% of the time. Its goal was 71%, so they're exceeding that. That's why the conditional formatting is green. Its projected seat utilization was 87%, and its actual was 72. So maybe some kids didn't show up for class or something there, who knows. And then it's trying to get to 65% utilization. So that's pretty good. The other thing that didn't jump out when I first looked at this one is there are sort of two numbers here, right? One of them is the course hours per week. So you've got so many course hours you need to support for utilization across the entire institution. So it's being used for 33.1 hours per week. And then it's got about 2.4 events per week in the space. So you're trying to get a sense of kind of velocity and volume both in terms of its utilization. So you can kind of understand this across every single room. So here's a room that's got a lot more events per week, but fewer course hours per week. So it's kind of got more things happening, but maybe smaller things happening when it happens. You can see its actual seat utilization is pretty close on the goal there. I just think that's an interesting way to look at it. If you think of all of the money that goes into physical space in an institution, this was a great little example of that. You can also look at all of this by room capacity. So it's looking at all rooms right now, but if I wanted to say, look, I really want to look at just rooms between, a little hard to use here, 50 and 100, I'm not going to get it exact, there we go. Just 50 and 100, now I'm looking at just a certain size room, and you can get a sense of whether you're effectively using that or not. So I think it's a pretty interesting way to tell a story about, are we using our rooms effectively or not? And to allow someone to go do a bit of analysis around that, it would help drive decisions for future investments. Third one, University of California, as it says, and you'll see this one, the link actually took you out to their site. They're using this as kind of an at a glance, right? So a lot of you on websites for institutions will have kind of here's what our program looks like. They've made this publicly available. I thought the interesting thing here was, a little bit of where students are coming from. You get a sense of where students are enrolling from, what their ethnicity is. You could pick an individual campus, so this must be intended to be for multiple locations. But if I just wanted to look at San Diego campus, now you see all of these numbers and metrics in that map below will adjust, hopefully. Pick the next one here, which is, I think, an interesting way to show, and this is from University of Denver, so an interesting one to show a little bit more of that factual spreadsheet kind of look and feel, but it's trying to get an understanding of a whole host of metrics by institutional research. So this is a way of taking, if you're in the institutional research department, the odds are pretty good that you're really comfortable with all this data and everything. But the reality is you can start to make it a bit more accessible to others through the use of a tool. I'm going to refresh this one here too, just because I haven't been in it in a bit. And this is where applications funding, what test scores looked like, acceptance rate across time. So they're not necessarily unique statistics, but they're maybe unique in the way that they're sharing them. So this is their fact book, again, a very public thing at many institutions. You can get a sense of graduates. I think in here somewhere there's a map that shows where graduates came from. Oh, there it is, applications by state. So you can see if I'm at the University of Denver, here's where my applications came from. Now, could you tell this with a report with a bunch of columns on it going straight down the list? Absolutely, you could. But this does tell me that, boy, if I want to know where my students come from, where am I going to go spend my marketing dollars and my recruiting dollars? Kids are coming from California, Texas, Colorado, Illinois, and Florida. That's the most common place. And I'm up here in Fargo, North Dakota. I wouldn't spend a lot of effort. We had 11 applications come from the entire state, 15 in Montana, right? So if you think about it, this is an at a glance kind of way to look at that and say, okay, where are my students coming from? And now maybe you think there's a great opportunity in a state, like I would maybe look at this and say Utah. Boy, I would think I would be able to get more people come from Utah or from New Mexico. I mean, Utah's a relatively populous state, highly educated. Maybe I can get more students to come from Utah to Colorado. Seems like I should be able to get more. So you can kind of focus those efforts appropriately. Even Oklahoma might be another example if I were at DU, I might look at that. So I think those are a great example of taking something that would just be straight columnar, simple data, and it gives you a way to tell a more effective story. Or a little bit of rankings here, comparing. I'm not sure I know that one, we'll skip that. So this is multiple use cases would be the point. Oops, surveys, here. Yeah, you get the general gist of it. This is somebody who's trying to make this data for the university very public and available. So I think that is an interesting use case. It's not always just the use of a tool inside your institution. So again, what I would encourage people to do is to take the link at the bottom of this page, go explore a little bit, find things that apply to your particular institution and where you can get some value out of that. With that, we actually do have one last polling question, and that is, what use case do you see as the best first or next application of data analytics at your institution? Option A is enrollment analysis, B is operational efficiency, educational quality and outcomes, fundraising, or is it something else? Okay, so we have some representation for enrollment analysis, operational efficiency, and quality and outcomes. I would say that's pretty representative, even though it's a small sample. I would say that's pretty representative of what we've seen. I will tell you just one editorial comment there is that, enrollment, it probably isn't going to get people too excited, meaning we're used to looking at that one a lot. Operational efficiency is a lot of times an easy place to start, meaning there's usually some low-hanging fruit in most higher education organizations, I would say. And then the educational quality and outcomes is maybe a little bit more exciting topic. People definitely like that. You're going to find people be very passionate about that. Obviously, every organization is different and what's going to build the momentum for you, but I would say that's a bit of editorial comment there. And with that, that is actually all of the prepared content we had. We'll take a couple of minutes here to see if there's any questions or anything. You can put them in the chat of the webinar.
Vanessa or John, did you guys have any closing statements, anything you wanted them to take away from this? That one statement that really stood out?
I don't at this time.
Great.
Yeah, I think the thing that I would just say is to combine some of the KPI stuff that Vanessa talked about with the tools that we've talked about at the end. So those are intended to be sort of tools and techniques, but think about how those KPIs apply to you. Oftentimes finding a few specific numbers to kind of drive activity is what jumpstarts an effort. And then the other thing I would say is don't try to solve it all at once. Pick a couple of things. One of the things that my colleagues, when I work with in a whole host of industries, I tell them is, look, find 5 or 6 things that you can really focus on. The real temptation here is once you realize what you can do, to go look at everything, and it's kind of a forest for the trees thing. Find a few things to really focus your efforts on, and that will go a long ways towards the success of your efforts.
Awesome.
Thank you for your time. Unless anybody else has anything, I think we're done, Amy.
Yes, thank you all for attending, and thank you to our presenters, and we hope that everyone has a great day.